think we now have a very good segue into another aspect of the entire tech ecosystem, which is that, especially because there's a lot of startups mainly focused in the tech domain, and you also have like fairly well established companies which are now. We often see a lot of manpower exchange between these two ecosystems. Right? So the first thing I want to understand is when somebody wants to transition from one to another, be it startups to mature companies or vice versa, what do you think might be the motivations for it? And in terms of like skill sets, in terms of advantages, disadvantages, can you just a little bit about that?
Okay, sure. So I think it's ultimately about, at any given life stage, I think it's about what are your expectations for next couple of years. Ultimately, work fits into the overall life. That is a kind of central premise of this one. And I think inherently so, um, smaller companies have higher risk profile. It's like a high risk, high reward situation, right? And bigger companies are low risk, low reward. Now, if so when people are moving, argument's sake, or let's say going with the flow, when people are moving from a big company to a small company, then naturally the thing would be that, for example, for certain people, it would be, hey, I have a certain, one use case or one scenario is that for some people, it's like, I have is a reasonable financial cushion for myself and I want to now play it big, right? And the second use case could be for, I want to do something meaningful at work. Because I think for many people working in big corporates, sometimes you start questioning why do you actually spend 50% of your living lives into something which has no consequence, right? I think, and likewise, if you look at from smaller companies to bigger companies, sometimes you say that, hey, I cannot tolerate this variability, if you will. I want to have a more steady life. Look, so call it as a low beta stock, right? So to say, low rewards, but that's fine. It has got low risk. But I think the thing also is low rewards also, or high risk, high rewards is also, I think one factor which people don't talk about is the learning effect. And I think unless people are intentional in a big company, simply because the way that the structure is, unless you are very, very intentional about immersing yourselves and kind of swimming against the tide, if you will, to find yourselves into more startup like projects inside big companies, which it depends. Sometimes they are there or it might not be there. More often than not, is learning also comes on the low reward side of the equation. I think that is something which is a third angle which people don't talk about, and this is something that, especially in the context of creating, a more like a pro startup kind of a view, I would say learning is something which people should have to talk about. And like we were talking about in the previous section, many of the people who are coming, let's say, college interns and whether it's engineering, tech guys, or HR, business marketing guys, many of these, I think we see this as a consistent pattern. Hey, I want to grow.
Correct.
I want to learn, right? And I think that's what kind of characterizes. Now, of course, to the topic of, the skills transferability when people are swimming from one pond to the other pond and the other pond to the other pond. So I think, while there are trade-offs we already talked about, but definitely there are skills that people can leverage upon. I think the first thing is to see that do you have an affinity for where you are going towards. Can you tolerate risk? Can you tolerate variability? Can you tolerate working in a no frills environment? Right? I mean, like for example, people in big corporates, they're always used to traveling over a certain number of hours in business class. In a startup, that is the last thing that you do. Sometimes you even think, can we go by bus?
Okay.
Instead of going in, pre-booked air-conditioned big taxis, you think about going in an auto or sometimes bike, right? So are you fine with those things is a personal disposition, personal hygiene as well, right? So that is one part. I think the second part is that are you willing to, is your family overall, when you're moving from a big to a small environment, is your family also bought into this equation or not. I think this is something which people have to think about, which people generally take unilateral decisions, and then there's a burnout situation and all. I think so. That is a kind of, I think some things which I can think about where people need to think in these dimensions when they do. Having said that, I think the other part is about the skills. I think people moving from big companies to small companies, and I would say companies which are very well established, like big tech to a small startup, you need to really see that are you really technically or skill wise equipped as well, because you have to be doing multiple heads, multiple roles. Yeah, for example, my role here is product and engineering, but I'm also helping sometimes on the sales side. We are also discussing strategy. It's like, you are fluid. You have to be more fluid. You have to be more flexible. So, which is probably a not so great asset in a big company, because if you are more flexible, you'll be seen as you're poking your nose everywhere. Whereas here, if you're not flexible, you'll be seen as, this guy has got only that much utility, because you have to fill in, you have to be like an amoeba, right? You have to occupy spaces, you have to get things done.
Yeah.
So I think, and again, this is not to say that in a big company, the get things done or get shit done attitude is not relevant. It is supported, but it depends on the company's culture. So I think that is the kind of way I would say. I mean, for example, Amazon, right, or AWS for that matter, they take pride in calling themselves a day one company. It's always day one. People are always working on projects. If, for example, I was talking to one of my friends, he's a head of sales operations, and he had some problem in some dashboard, and he went to his manager, this guy is not doing this work. He said, did you try? And he was taken aback because he was coming from a tier one management consulting firm, and he's not used to, did you try to actually poke into the Power BI dashboard and try to fix it? And so that's kind of a shock, right? So it is about the company culture. But whereas if you were to go in another established, any other Fortune 100 MNC, you are supposed to work in your bracket. So I think these are all the kind of things about how do you want to swim from one point to other, which life stage you are at, what do you expect from work life, how does it fit into your family things, what kind of risk, what is the learning, what gives you satisfaction in life. I think those are all the kind of considerations that I would probably suggest here.
And I would like to add a couple of points here. See, although we talked about different factors why people might be transitioning, right? When we talk about the benefits, right, when you transition from, let's say, startup to mature companies or mature companies to startup, what do they bring on the table, right? So when you talk about startups, the philosophy of how you build or how you operate is very different from sometimes how mature companies operate. In startups, you have to be highly innovative, highly iterative. You have to have great appetite for learning. You have to constantly keep iterating, measuring, learning, and until you get that perfect recipe, right? What we call as the build, measure, learn loop, right? Whereas when you talk about many times mature companies, people come with systems, process, and has been defined for a very long period of time, and people have been operating in that systems and process. So what we've usually seen that, especially when it comes to startups, right? People transitioning from mature companies to startup, that could be a great advantage they bring onto the startup, right? While you need to be highly innovative, highly iterative, you need to be T-shaped, flexible, you also need systems and processes, right? Okay. People who come from these mature organizations can bring that to the startup table, right? They can build that systems, process, build SOPs, which can really help the company also do this build, measure, learn cycle in a much faster way, right? So I think the combination of that makes a great success recipe. You can also talk the other way, right? Many times the companies simply die because they simply stop innovating, right? You need people who constantly innovate. So people from startup background transitioning to mature companies can bring in those skill set, right? Because they have been working on those environments, they have been constantly building, they have those attributes, they can bring that to many of the mature companies, right? So I think that's two of the areas where it could benefit from, let's say, transition, both the sides, right? Transitioning is what I highly think.
So, I think what I'm taking away from this is it's sort of like a symbiotic relationship. The more established companies need the fresh blood, enthusiasm, and energy that is infused by folks who transition out of the startup ecosystem, right? And the maturity, stability, and experience that is usually brought in by built over a long span of time, which comes in from the more mature companies, is also something required by startups for them to be able to scale, right? So now, in terms of folks from startups going to mature companies, I think I would probably term it as fairly straightforward. You apply to big companies, you get referrals, and you probably try and find your way through. But I understand that when you're transitioning from a more mature company to a startup, as you mentioned, Ajay, the risk profile is higher, right? And you need to be really passionate and really sure about yourself in terms from a skills aspect and from your other factors aspect, like your family, your situation in life, etc., to sort of take up that sort of risk profile that's associated with the sort of startup ecosystem. Now, I just want to sort of understand this. I want to sort of dig in a little deeper here. Is one, should especially folks when they're probably say around 45, 50, when they're reaching almost saturating in their growth in their respective companies, usually at this point, they also sort of want to see what are the other opportunities available, right? So what do you think are from a startup's point of view, because there is a certain amount of interest on that side as well, what do you think are ways they can attract such talent to their startups? What do you think? What's the recruitment space like here? What are the recruitment channels? How is it that both parties can explore and find each other?
Well, that's a very, very, very interesting topic. I would say maybe I can give the perspective because I came from a big tech company to a thing. I'll be very honest, I had some view that I wanted to do things. I must say that it was less about, as they say, you reach the highest level of your incompetence in a big company, but it was more like, hey, I can make more impact. I'm not able to make more impact, right? So it's like, okay, so that is the kind of thing that was there. And I think what works best is because, when you are going into a high risk environment, right? When you're jumping from a very stable pond to kind of very tumultuous puddle, right? So you have to really decide, okay, when I'm making that particular journey, then how do I kind of cut the risks, right? And there you generally go through your trusted circles, right? So I think for me, I'm talking about personally, I think what worked is that I talked to my friends who had connections in those things, right? Or for example, angel investor networks that I was part of or I was consulting. I will also talk to universities, for example, who are kind of incubating. I will talk to friends who have been running incubators, right? And like Entler is pretty popular in this region and so on. So I'll use some of those trusted networks, if you will, to find, okay, here is the entire universe of startups, right? And I think the other thing which I would also see too, so that is the path, right? Whether it's, first of all, it's friends, angel networks that you're part of, university communications, incubators, accelerators, and so on. That gives you the full population set, if you will, that you have access to, right? You'll not go out of the blue and just go to talk to anyone, right? I think the second thing also is to have understanding, would you fit with the folks who are running the show, number one. Have in-depth conversations with them. Don't rush in, don't hurry. See, when I went to a big company like Meta, it's very straightforward, right? You go through the interviews, you make 8-10 rounds of interviews, and this is what you're going to do, right? It's independent of the individual.
Right.
It's a corporation that you're dealing with. Here you are dealing with peoples and personalities, right? So you find your path, you talk to the people, you take your time, you take ample amount of time because you're not in a rush. You should not be in a rush, right? Just like you're talking about the false positives have a higher chance when you make these decisions, right? I think as you do this particular part, I think the most important part which will keep you going is this a problem that gels with your ethos or not? That will keep you going. So so founders, people who are working there, I think when I was coming to Custiv, we spent like almost 6 months talking. right? And that tells perseverance on both sides. I think that is something which, all the kind of signals that you get, right? And importantly, is this a problem that you really care about? Is this a problem that gels you? Because that will keep you going, because startup is not like, for example, in a big company, even if you are there for, let's say, 5 years in a company, you'll probably change roles 2-3 times, right? Your goalpost keeps shifting. You are busy in the chaos of life, as they call it as, and 5 years later, you'll realize, what did I do? Here, it's a long game in a startup. You don't sign up for, hey, I'll be here for 6 months, then I'll take another role here, right? You're here, you're wedded to the problem. Either you fix it or you get out of the loser.
Right.
I think so. This is how I would kind of navigate this particular path. This is how I would recommend folks to think about their navigation. People who are coming from the big one to a small, or I don't know, Maqsood, do you have any comments there or the other way around?
Yeah, Maqsood, I want to understand also your aspect. Like, for example, Ajay was the one making the jump from the big pond to the smaller puddle, and now I want to know your aspect very quickly in terms of how is it that you can attract such people to your company or whatever you're building, sir.
So I think when you talk about attracting the right people, especially people transitioning from, let's say, mature organization to the startup, right? One, the problem statement has to be very exciting or attractive, and people has to feel that they are in for the longer game, right? And they have enough skin in the game to solve for the problem. That's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, I think typically, I mean, I've been asked this question by many of investors as well, right? Recently, when I was talking to one of the investors, I got a same question that how did this happen, right? Because typically this happens at a very later stage of life.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important that even though in many of the startups it happened at a very later stage where many people from mature organizations make transition to startups. But if you had some sort of a growth or you're looking for that next phase of acceleration, right, where you already built the, let's say, the initial bootstrap to a certain extent, and you want to scale from there, right? And that is when it is the right time to bring in such people, right? So to attract, you have to provide them with enough skin in the game, as well as the problem statement has to be exciting and very clear path on how you're going to grow the company from here and what do they get out of this, right? As long as you can provide this, as long as you can make these things very clear, I think then you can attract the right talent for people transitioning from mature organization to startup, even at a very early stage of your growth journey, basically.
So I think it all boils down to once more, both parties taking enough time. Second is the way
That's a good hiring lesson, by the way.
that's a great hiring lesson.
Yeah.
I think it is basically that be out there and make sure that your value is very clearly communicated and you are able to figure out a way in which all parties involved are able to have some sort of skin in the game.
Correct.
While they're also passionate about
Absolutely.
I think this has been very insightful, especially this segment. Lot of lessons and building. So thank you for your time and for all this podcast today.
Yes, absolutely. It was brilliant talking to both of you. I think we are hoping to sort of put this together and really get it out to all the folks out there, especially listening to the podcast. And also, I'm hoping that they have a lot to learn. Hopefully, your DMs will be open in case should they choose to reach out with a couple of questions.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.